So joining me now, glad to have with us today, Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers. Randi, nice to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining me. I know that you don't want to address this case specifically because you don't have teachers who are involved in it, but just in a broader sense in terms of this issue of these books and their impact across the board, you have really talked about protecting books of all kinds in Florida and other places across the board. So do you think twice when you listen to some of these examples of what's being read to 4 to 6-year-olds?
So, Martha, first off, thank you for having me on, and I hope that we get to all the other issues in terms of education. But I would say that this is a hard case because parents, of course, have rights in terms of educating their kids, and schools have to be communities. And the moment you have a case like this with such great distrust for what is being taught in a classroom or read in a classroom, I consider that a failure from the beginning. And I say this as someone who is a gay person who understands that we have to actually make sure that families are respected and families are safe and kids are safe and that differences are acknowledged and differences are embraced. But, you know, once you get a case like this where, you know, parents are uncomfortable about what is being read to their kids in a classroom, this is something that has to be dealt with in a local level, not in the Supreme Court. And so parents have rights, and they should have rights in terms of what is being taught in classrooms. And, you know, and we're going to have to actually deal with how we ensure that kids have a safe and welcoming environment, and that we see differences and we accept differences, whether those differences are religious or whether those differences are sexual, and that we actually make sure that the community you know, is there as a community. So
do you believe, though, that there's an appropriate age to have a discussion? These are 4 to 6-year-olds, and they're being read, and this is out loud in the classroom, not just, oh, this is a book on the shelf in the library. If there's a particular child that, you know, you might want to read this with, but, you know, just as an example, my pronouns are like the weather. They change depending on how I feel, and that's okay because they're my words. Sometimes I use all the pronouns I can think of, just as one example here.
Let me put it this way, Martha, and I think that this will be shocking to you. These would not be the books I would be reading as a classroom teacher to kids who are 4 to 6 years old. And I say this, I went through the New York City public school system. I was a teacher during when we had the big issue around Heather Has Two Mommies. And I think when you don't actually make sure that things are age appropriate and we don't actually have sufficient conversations with teachers and parents in terms of how we accept differences, then you have situations like this right now. And so my concern about this case is that it is, you know, that it could pit people against each other, when what we really need to be doing is we need to be making sure that every one of God's children is accepted in our classrooms. And whether that person is an evangelical Christian or whether that person is the daughter or the son of, you know, gay parents, that is our obligation in schools. So, you know, it's a failure of all of us that this case is in the Supreme Court right now.
So, you know, it seems to me that the failure for all of us is what has happened to our kids in terms of their education. And I think what disturbs a lot of parents, religious background or non-religious background, is that they see this, you know, woke ideology as, you know, sort of the common phrase around all of this happening. And they're looking at the numbers and saying, why are you reading this book to my child when, first of all, I want to deal with this kind of discussion at home based on my own understanding of where my child might be, and B, the numbers are plummeting. Look at this. I mean, if this isn't a failure that needs to be so much more important than whether or not you're reading a book about your pronouns. This is the Maryland rankings. 4th graders, these same little kids who've had these books, you know, fed to them at a very young age, their reading ranked in 2013, they were second in the nation in Maryland. 2024, 20th. Math, 16th in the nation, plummeting down to 39th. So if I were a parent in this district, I would be saying, please, please, leave these books out of the picture. Teach my child to read and to do math, okay?
So, yes,
and let's focus
totally,
on let's focus on why we're there.
So can we focus on that? Which is like, let's focus on the kind of things that we should be doing for kids. Because if you actually, so this is not a district that I represent. It's represented ably by the NEA, and they've done a terrific job. But let's talk about the NAEP scores for a minute, not the Maryland Lake scores. Why don't you put up the
Well, you have, I think, about
NAEP
18,000
scores.
teachers in the Maryland district at large. So.
No, but these are, so let's talk about the NAEP scores, for example, in Florida, which is like, you know, a lot of people look at Florida and say that that is the king, that is the mother of all mothers of school choice. Their NAEP scores are the lowest. They really plummeted in the same way. Let's look at the NAEP scores in Massachusetts, which some people would say, probably on your, you know, in your on your network, that those, you know, that the Massachusetts scores or the Massachusetts schools are very much embedded in equality and diversity. So let's look at what happens in Massachusetts that really works, and what happens in Florida that doesn't work. What happens in Massachusetts that works is that there is far more funding, and there is a real culture of a safe and welcoming school. Well, and what we need to do is we need to actually do more of that.
So you're saying that because, you know, if we can find other areas around the country where the proficiency levels are also abysmal and should be embarrassing to any education organization, that we can start to make assessments and say that, oh, it's because of choice or it's because of money. We know that money does not equate a better outcome, because in Newark, New Jersey, you have a per student, per capita expenditure that is one of the highest in the country. And you have very difficult outcome.
Martha, sweetheart, listen to me.
Please don't call me sweetheart.
It actually does. I'm sorry, my bad. It actually does matter. And in fact, some of the most, some of the conservative folks who used to say that money doesn't matter actually have changed their mind. So the issue,
well, they wanted to go to different programs and choice programs and be able to give it to parents who want to homeschool their kids and provide.
No, I'm talking about people who are actually been looking at these numbers, and what I'm saying to you is this: things like Title I, which Mississippi used to hugely increase its literacy rates, that money really does matter, and conservatives, liberals, all believe that we should actually have Title I in schools, and the disproportionate amount of money goes to red districts. Like 20% of Mississippi education funding.
One of the things that they've done in Mississippi is to expand choice. They're also doing something really important in Mississippi, which is to expand teacher training, because they realize that the teachers themselves do not necessarily understand the things that they're supposed to be teaching, which is a massive problem across the country. So I do give them credit for that. You know, however, we must be clear-eyed about the fact that our students over the past 20 years have had very difficult, very weakened outcome. And we see it at the college level. We see it when kids are being pushed through these systems. I was talking to a teacher the other day. She said, I can't hold a kid back who can't read in third grade. I am forced to push him through the system.
So Martha, I agree with that teacher, and it's a problem. I mean, if you think about what has happened over the course of the last 50 years, the first 20 or 30 years of federal intervention in education was about the money and was about really focused on opportunity. The Johnson years, even the Nixon years, those things were actually, and you saw scores rise. Frankly, you saw scores starting to level off when it became about test scores as opposed to about kids' needs and the opportunities. And so what we want to do is we want to do more of what Mississippi just did. The teacher training there was terrific. And frankly, we're using some of the teacher training there. It's called Reading Universe. It's some of the science of reading programs that we and my union support. So
well, let me ask you this. You know, I think that's very interesting because
wait.
Go ahead.
Let me just finish. The things that we spend 90% of our time on, I spend 90% of my time on issues like numeracy and literacy and critical thinking and problem solving and what we need to do to help every single child succeed. And ultimately, that's what we should be doing in public schools. And what the federal role is, it's actually to fill opportunity gaps. So you heard me at the beginning of your show on talking about this. I think parents need to have rights. I think it was a failure of what happened in Maryland.
One of the problems is it's such a distraction from what we should be focusing on in school. I mean, I know that you ran conferences where there were classes on using teachable moments to create welcoming classrooms around LGBT issues, how to deal with this issue inside and outside of the classroom. And I don't want to go back down that rabbit hole, but I do want to ask you one question before I let you.
So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Because if you have a kid in your class who's gay,
right,
you have to figure out a way to create a welcoming and safe environment. But if you also have, if you looked at that same conference, we had tons of time on artificial intelligence, on career tech ed. So what teachers have to do is we have to embrace everything that society throws at us. We have to deal with.
Here's what I would say. I would say this: if you have a child in the classroom who's gay, you have a child in a classroom who maybe doesn't speak the language very clearly, you have all kinds of struggles that have honestly existed since the beginning of time.
Right.
I think you want to have a principal in a classroom that says we always respect each other. We don't call each other names. We respect each other. And then beyond that, those are behavior issues, right? And you have to deal with behavior issues, but you don't want to indoctrinate children. You don't want a child to hear a book read to the whole classroom and go home and say, why am I being taught that I was born a girl, but that was just a guess? I mean, that is going to freak out some children. They're going to be very confused at 4, 5, and 6 years old. And I know you said that you don't agree with reading this in the classroom, but I'm saying this is the problem. Then that same kid can't read and is pushed all the way to 8th grade and they still can't read.
So Martha, I suspect that you and I agree on more that we don't. I know you don't believe me.
No, I didn't say that.
What I'm saying to you is that I saw that case, and if you have not socialized books with parents, and a book that may be controversial, and you haven't actually talked to your parents of your kids in that classroom, that's going to be a problem regardless of what's in the book. And look, that was a problem. Think about Catcher in the Rye. Think about To Kill a Mockingbird. Think about other books at different eras. That's a problem. You have to actually spend time as a school teacher or a school principal with parents before you end up talking about issues that some people will think is controversial. And so but what I'm saying to you is that 90% of teachers' times in classrooms are not about that. 90% of teachers' times in classrooms are about how we engage kids to actually be their full selves. How we make sure that kids actually
I'm honestly less
and
concerned with them being
other.
their full self than I am with them being able to read and write and do math. And that is the biggest problem that we face in our schools today. And if I talk to one more teacher who tells me that they are not allowed to hold a child back who cannot read until he gets to the level where he can read. So let's just, I
agree with you.
I'll worry at home about whether or not, my child's whole self. But what I really need is for the school to teach them to read and write and do math and not get into all of this other stuff. So, Randi, I appreciate you coming. I always enjoy our conversations, and I think it's a really important dialogue, and I appreciate you coming here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randi Weingarten.
Hey, it's Will Kane. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.